Most women would have swallowed the insult, buried it under a forced smile, and pretended not to hear. But not her. Not this time. It was the way he said it, slow, deliberate, letting the words cut deeper than any shout could. Too old to matter. 4 words that scraped against every unspoken insecurity she had fought to silence for years. 4 words that made the air in the kitchen feel heavy, thick with something rancid, like the leftovers of a conversation that had been rotting for years. He didn't even look at her when he said it. His eyes were on his phone, his voice calm as though commenting on the weather. That's what made it worse. He wasn't trying to win an argument or lash out in anger. He was just stating it like a fact, like gravity. And you know when someone delivers cruelty without heat, it's because they've believed it for a long time. You've probably been there, haven't you? Listening to someone you love talk about you as if you're not in the room, as if you're already irrelevant. There's a kind of quiet violence in that moment, the kind that makes your ears buzz and your hands still because you're deciding, right then and there, if you're going to disappear or if you're going to become someone they'll regret underestimating. She didn't respond. Not then. She stirred the soup on the stove as if the rhythm of the spoon could hold her together. He walked out without a glance, muttering something about real decisions being made elsewhere, and she just stood there staring into the steam until it blurred everything. Later that night, she sat in bed with the light off, listening to the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. His side of the bed was empty. It often was these days. She wasn't the type to check his phone or follow him, no. She understood a different kind of power, one that required patience. If you've ever been underestimated, you know that's the one advantage they hand you without realizing time to watch, to gather, to plan. It started small. She began paying attention to the way he handled money, or rather the way he didn't. Receipts stuffed into drawers, bills half opened, casual mutterings about just moving some numbers around as if finances were a magic trick only he understood. But she noticed the tension in his jaw when the phone rang from numbers he didn't save. She noticed the unopened envelopes stacked neatly in the study, the ones with red warnings in bold letters. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. Something colder had settled in. You see, anger burns fast and leaves you empty. But cold lasts. Cold lets you think clearly, lets you play the long game without flinching. And she was very, very cold. So when he started needing her signature for a few things, she didn't ask too many questions. A property sale here? A loan document there? She signed carefully, reading every line, committing every figure to memory. He assumed she was doing it out of loyalty. He had no idea that with every signature, she was learning the map of his empire, the debts, the assets, the silent partners who didn't want their names attached to his crumbling facade. People think power is in money. It's not. Power is in knowledge, specifically knowledge that someone thinks you're too stupid, too naive, or too old to have. And that's how it happened. Slowly, methodically, she began to weave herself into the threads of his financial life. He gave her access without realizing it because arrogance blinds men like him more than love ever could. He thought she was harmless. He thought she was still the woman who waited for him to come home, who asked if he wanted coffee in the morning. In truth, she was memorizing account numbers and contact names, learning which clients were unstable, which ones were dangerous, and which ones might be willing to turn on him if given the right incentive. The shift came on a rainy Thursday. She was in the study going through a pile of contracts he'd left on the desk when she found the one that made her stop breathing. His signature already on the line next to a deal that would bankrupt them if it failed. And it would fail. She could see it in the margins, in the wild projections, in the desperate way the numbers tried to promise more than reality could deliver. She held the paper in her hands, listening to the rain against the window, and realized she didn't have to warn him. She didn't have to save him. Not anymore. The woman he called too old to matter was now the only person who could decide whether his empire lived or died. And she wasn't planning to save him. Not yet. Rain still needled the windows the next morning, like the weather was taking her side. He breezed into the kitchen with his cologne, and his laugh kissed the air somewhere near her cheek, and started talking to the toast about a networking brunch. She watched the way he arranged himself in the doorway, a man rehearsing youth in a house that had memorized all of his exits. When he left, the scent hung there, artificial and expensive like a sticker slapped on something cracked. She went into the study and dialed the number on the letterhead. A soft-voiced woman answered on the second ring. Bergen Wyatt Accounting. "Yes," she said, smoothing her tone into the gentle silk of a wife who never asks for more than she's given. "This is Mariana, Mr. Hart's wife. I noticed a discrepancy on the issued checks. Could you walk me through the last quarter's payroll? A pause, then the whisper of a keyboard. One moment, Mrs. Hart. You've learned this lesson, haven't you? If you sound harmless, doors open. If you sound like you're already inside, nobody thinks to ask who gave you the key. By noon, she knew where the money was leaking. Not in big flashy gushes, but in small punctures masked by ego and image. Overbilled contractors. Consulting fees to a firm registered to a P.O. box. Late fees piling up because he'd rather posture than negotiate. The accountant tried to protect him, of course. Loyalty forged by years of intimidation and holiday hampers. But even loyalty falters when numbers insist on saying the quiet part out loud. That afternoon, her daughter stormed in wearing disappointment like eyeliner. Dad said you called the office, Lila said, arms crossed, mouth a line drawn with a ruler. Ah, the golden daughter, polished with praise, groomed to mirror the father's son. She was 22 and glittering with the certainty of someone who'd never had to pay their own late fees. Mariana remembered when she'd been like that too, before she understood that charisma is just a spotlight. It doesn't make the stage sturdier. I asked for clarity, Mariana said, arranging the pile of contracts with careful fingers. That's all. Dad handles it. He always has. Lila's voice had his music in it. You don't understand how these things work. There it was, that thin blade of contempt passed down like an heirloom. You know the sting. The one that says your experience is outdated, your instincts are quaint. You've been told to step aside by people who got the map from you and now pretend they discovered the road. Mariana nodded as if agreeing and let the girl leave with her righteousness intact. But when the door closed, she called the bank. Her voice was different now, calibrated for the woman on the other end who wore neutral suits and held power like a pen. I'm calling about the Hart operating account, she said. The signatory list needs to be updated. We're instituting dual authorization for any outgoing amounts above $10,000. The bank manager hesitated. We'll need your husband to sign the... He asked me to arrange it, Mariana cut in soft but firm, an orchestra of reason and inevitability. Our auditors insisted. You know how they are. There was paperwork, of course. There are always rituals before a transfer of power, the small rites you must pass through so nobody can claim they didn't see the storm clouds forming. She scheduled a meeting, printed forms, baked a lemon loaf for the receptionist. People remember sweetness when it arrives with signatures. People make allowances when the woman in front of them refuses to be either brittle or begging. He came home late that night, eyes glassy with triumph that didn't reach his mouth. Small hiccup, he said, shrugging out of his jacket. The investor wants to see cash flow stabilized. They'll wire the second tranche as soon as we implement dual authorization, she said, passing him a pen as if it were a spoon. I handled it. He blinked a lazy smile, faltering. You handled it. You were in meetings all day. I thought I'd save you time. She kept her face calm, attentive, like the quiet mother archetype, the one who knows how to pour tea while setting the chessboard. You'll still have full control. It's just that my signature will accompany yours for amounts above 10, for optics. His eyes returned to their phone glass shine, assessing her for weaknesses. Optics, he repeated, rolling the word like a stone in his cheek. And because it sounded like an opportunity to appear prudent because it could be spun as his idea later, he signed. You felt that, didn't you? The paper changing temperature in her hands, the invisible hinge in the door, the moment when being underestimated turns from wound to weapon. The accountant called the next day. More open, less loyal. There's also the matter of the vendor balances. Some haven't been paid in 90 days. Mrs. Hart, with dual authorization, you'll be looped into all outgoing payments. A careful breath. Will you be signing the checks? She glanced at the stack of bills that had been trying to shame their way into his attention. The printing company, the marble supplier, the florist who dressed their charity galas like a fairy tale. She saw more than amounts. She saw live small businesses trying to keep their own refrigerators humming at night. Yes, she said, and felt the corridor ahead of her straighten. Yes, I will. That week she drove to the sites he never visited anymore, his projects, his boasts. She walked the scaffolding, shook hands with foremen who had been living on promises, recalculated schedules without the glitter of his exaggerations. Men looked past her, at first searching for him, then realized they were looking at the person who would decide if they got paid Friday. Respect is a fast learner when money is a study guide. At dinner, he talked about a woman from the investor's office, young, sharp, relentless, letting the words flex, waiting for her to flinch. She didn't. She knew the silhouette of the shadow wife, the one who exists only in a man's appetite for new mirrors. She smiled, asked about the investor's expectations, and watched him lie in tiny, practiced increments. Too old to matter, he had said. She remembered it now against the chandelier's tremble, the napkins folded like white flags. And she thought, if I am old, then I am the kind of old that knows where every exit is. You might not admit it out loud, but part of you enjoys the patience of this, don't you? The slow assembling of a life raft while the captain insists the ship is unsinkable. You've learned not to scream. Screaming alerts the wrong people. Quiet alerts the right doors. By Friday, her name was on the payroll system. The bank recognized her voice. Vendors took her calls before noon. He still floated on top of it all, crafting a narrative where his genius had orchestrated the new controls where the stability belonged to him. Let him, she thought. Sometimes letting a man keep his story is the easiest way to take his power. She sat at the dining table that night with the first stack of checks, the room lit like a confession. She picked up a pen. Power didn't hum. It breathed quiet and steady like sleep after a long fever. She signed. By the end of the month, his tone had shifted just enough for someone listening closely to hear. The arrogance was still there, yes, but it came threaded with something new, hesitation. She recognized it in the pauses between his sentences, the moments when his eyes flickered toward her before making a decision. A man like him never admits uncertainty out loud. It seeps through in the spaces where he used to speak without thinking. The first crack came over breakfast. He was reading the paper, pretending the balance sheet on his phone wasn't draining the color from his face. "We'll need to push the launch event," he said, buttering his toast like it wasn't a sentence that would ripple through his entire network. She didn't look up from her tea, already spoke to the caterers. "They've moved us to the following month. It will give the press more time to build momentum." He stared at her for a beat too long, like a man realizing his house had been rearranged while he slept. "Right," he said, finally lowering the knife. "You know that feeling, don't you? When someone starts realizing the quiet person in the room is the one moving the pieces. They don't say thank you. They just begin to look at you differently, sometimes like a threat, sometimes like a lifeline. And the truth is, you're both." It wasn't just about signing checks anymore. She was approving contracts, redirecting payments, and most importantly, making sure the right people owed her, not him. A florist who had been chasing invoices for 6 months got her payment overnight along with a handwritten note. The marble supplier received a deposit and a direct line to her personal phone. Every call she made tightened a thread in the web she was spinning, not around herself, but around him. He noticed the shift in loyalty. Of course he did. He tried to make jokes about it. "You're becoming quite the businesswoman," he'd say, laughing in a way that tried to turn observation into flattery. But flattery feels thin when it's stretched over suspicion. Then came the dinner party, their home filled with the usual mix of investors, sycophants, and beautiful people who spoke in curated tones. She wore a black dress with a neckline sharp enough to cut glass, and a silence that made people lean in to hear her. When the man from the marble company arrived, he didn't greet her husband first. He shook her hand, thanked her for making things right, and slipped his business card into her palm. Her husband's smile froze the way ice does before it cracks. That night, after the guests had left and the glasses stood empty, he finally said it. "You've been busy." She looked at him over the rim of her wine glass. "I've been cleaning up after you." His face darkened, not with rage, but with the slow dawning of someone realizing the ground beneath them is no longer theirs. "Careful," he said. "You've heard that word before, haven't you, careful? The word men use when they still think they have the authority to warn you." But she didn't need to be careful. Not anymore. The bank accounts, the vendor relationships, the trust of his inner circle, those were hers now. The next week she attended a meeting in his place. He had another commitment and sent her as a stand-in, thinking it would be a placeholder gesture. But she didn't just sit there and nod. She negotiated better terms, cut unnecessary costs, and secured an extension that gave their finances room to breathe. When she walked out, the lead investor followed her to the elevator. "You should be the one we're talking to from now on," he said. That night, her husband brought it up over dinner, casual as a blade left on the table. "I heard you impressed them." "I wasn't trying to," she replied. Which was true. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply doing what needed to be done, a concept foreign to a man who lived on image. The shift was complete when the bank sent over the updated authorization documents. He skimmed the letter, his eyes flicking to hers. "So I can't move anything over 10 without you now." "That's correct," she said, and took another sip of tea. It was in that moment right there that she saw it, the fear. He hid it well, wrapped it in a smirk, but it was there all the same. The knowledge that the woman he once called too old to matter was now the gatekeeper to every decision that kept his world standing. And you know what the cruelest kind of revenge is? It's not slamming the door. It's holding it open just enough for them to see that they're allowed through only on your terms. He didn't thank her. He didn't apologize. Men like him rarely do, but he began to ask before acting. Small things at first, then bigger ones. The deference slipped in quietly, almost by accident, like he didn't notice it happening. But she noticed. Oh, she noticed. One night she stood in the study, the lamplight spilling over stacks of contracts and invoices, and she realized something she didn't need to destroy him. That would be too quick. No, she would let him keep standing just with the knowledge that every step he took now depended on her hand. That's the thing about power. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits across the table from you, sipping tea, waiting for you to understand who's really in control. The real fracture came on a Tuesday, the kind of day that pretends to be ordinary. He'd been out since morning, his calendar full of meetings with names she now knew better than he did. When he finally returned, his jacket slung over his shoulder, he tossed a folder onto the dining table like it was a harmless stack of paper. But she could smell urgency before she even opened it. The pages inside were frantic terms scribbled in the margins, numbers that didn't align, signatures missing where they mattered most. A bridge loan, high interest, short term, dangerous. "You need to sign this," he said, as if it were a routine grocery list. Her eyes stayed on the contract. "Why?" "It's a temporary fix. Keeps the investors calm until the next payout cycle." He reached for the pen on the table, the one she'd been using to approve payroll. "You sign, we breathe. Easy. You know that move, don't you?" The push for urgency, the insistence on skipping the details. It's the oldest trick in the book, pressure someone into acting before they have the full picture. But she had learned the truth about urgency. It's a mask for desperation. She placed her hand over the pen. "I'll review it tonight." His jaw tightened. "It's time sensitive." "So is my signature," she said. Her tone was velvet, but her eyes stayed sharp. That night, after he'd retreated to his office with his drink, she spread the documents across the bed like a crime scene. The more she read, the clearer it became this wasn't a temporary fix. It was a lifeline thrown into an ocean of debt, and the rope was fraying before it even reached the water. If she signed, she'd be binding herself to it just as tightly as him. Instead, she called one of the investors directly. The man was surprised to hear from her, but not resistant. "Off the record," she began, "I'd like to know if you were made aware of the bridge loan proposal." Silence, then a sigh. "We declined it last week. Too risky. If he's still trying to push it through, that's concerning." She hung up, knowing two things: the loan was dead in the water, and her husband was lying to her face about it. That lie didn't sting. It confirmed something she had suspected for weeks. He wasn't just reckless. He was flailing. The next morning, she set the unsigned contract in the center of the table. "I spoke to them," she said. "They're not interested. You should stop wasting time." His face didn't move, but his eyes betrayed him. There it was again, that flicker of recognition that she was no longer someone to bypass. For the next few weeks, she made her moves quietly. She renegotiated payment terms with suppliers to free up cash flow. She cut unnecessary contracts, the kind he'd kept to maintain the illusion of grandeur. She even pulled a favor from a contact she hadn't spoken to in years, securing a smaller but safer line of credit under her authorization alone. He noticed the changes, but not fast enough. The staff began calling her for approval instead of him. The vendors stopped chasing him for payment. His phone, once a constant chorus of demands, grew quieter, and the quieter it got, the more restless he became. One evening, as she was reviewing a quarterly report, he leaned against the doorway. "Do you enjoy this?" he asked. "Enjoy what?" "This control." The word tasted bitter in his mouth. She didn't look up. "I enjoy stability. You should try it." You could feel the temperature drop in that moment, couldn't you? The part where the person who once dismissed you realizes you don't even need their acknowledgement anymore. That's the sharpest blade you can wield. Not hatred, not revenge, just indifference. The breaking point came in the form of a phone call. An investor was threatening to pull out unless certain financial guarantees were met. But the guarantees, as it happened, required her signature. She took the call herself, listened, negotiated, and by the time she hung up, the investor was not only staying, but doubling their contribution on the condition that she remained in charge of disbursements. When she told him, he laughed in disbelief. They insisted, she replied. It was then that he sat down across from her, hands clasped like he was holding something fragile between them. "I never meant," he stopped himself as though the words were too expensive to finish. She leaned back in her chair. "You never meant what?" His eyes searched hers for a crack, a place where guilt or nostalgia might let him in, but she'd built walls higher than his pride could climb. "You've done well," he said instead, the closest he could come to surrender. And isn't that the sweetest moment when the man who called you too old to matter is forced to admit you're the reason he's still afloat without saying the words out loud? Because saying them would be admitting defeat. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The checkbook was in front of her, the pen in her hand. She was already deciding which payments would go out next. And he knew, just as you do, that once a person starts deciding where the money flows, they're the ones steering the ship. That night she signed 3 checks. None of them had his name on them. The invitations went out without his approval. Thick ivory envelopes, gold-embossed lettering, each sealed with her initials instead of the family crest he liked to parade. They were for a strategic appreciation dinner at the city's most exclusive rooftop venue, her event, her guest list. She called it a thank you to the people who had kept the business breathing. He found out about it 3 days before the date. "You didn't tell me you were hosting something," he said, voice clipped as though etiquette had been breached. "You weren't invited," she replied, not lifting her eyes from the ledger she was balancing. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, and you know that weight, it's the sound of a man realizing the rooms he thought he owned are now being filled without him. The night of the dinner, the air was cool and sharp, the kind of weather that made the skyline glitter like it had something to prove. She wore deep emerald silk, her hair pinned in a style that revealed the confident slope of her neck. The elevator doors opened to a space humming with quiet power. Investors, suppliers, and key partners greeted her with warmth that wasn't polite, it was genuine. They knew who had been signing their checks. She moved through their crowd like she had been doing it all her life, because in truth she had, just in smaller, invisible ways that no one noticed when he was at the center. But this time, there was no him. This time the light didn't have to pass through him to reach her. Halfway through the evening she caught sight of him. Of course he came. Men like him can't resist the gravitational pull of influence even when they're no longer the source of it. He was standing near the balcony, hands in his pockets, surveying the crowd as if trying to decide whether to be charming or confrontational. She didn't go to him. She let him come to her, and when he did, his smile was tight. "Quite the gathering," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Isn't it?" she replied, her own smile warm but unreadable. "These are the people who make things possible." "You mean for us," he corrected. She tilted her head. It landed. You could feel it in the way his eyes shifted, how he glanced at the people surrounding her, people who weren't looking at him at all. They were looking at her, waiting for her to introduce them to open doors he no longer had the keys to. When dessert was served, she took the microphone. Her voice was steady, each word deliberate. "Tonight is about gratitude," she said. "About honoring those who believed in this work, who stayed when things were uncertain. You've trusted me with your time, your resources, your reputations. And I don't take that lightly. This isn't just a business, it's a responsibility, one I will continue to protect." She didn't look at him when she said it, but she didn't have to. Every ear in that room heard the subtext. She wasn't promising to protect him. She was promising to protect the empire, something she now owned in all but name. After the applause, he cornered her near the bar. "You're enjoying this a little too much," he murmured. "Enjoying?" She swirled the wine in her glass. "No, I'm preserving what you nearly burned to the ground. You think you're untouchable now." She set the glass down, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I don't think it. I know it. Because every one of those people out there understands something you don't. Loyalty follows the one who pays on time." He took a step closer, but she didn't move. It wasn't defiance. It was the stillness of someone who no longer needed to play defense. "You felt that shift before, haven't you? The moment when you realize you're no longer reacting to someone's power, you're holding it. It's heavier than you expect, but it fits in your hands just the same." By the end of the night, she had secured 3 new partnerships and renegotiated 2 old contracts on better terms. All of it without his input, all of it under her signature. Back home, the apartment felt too small for the new reality. He tossed his jacket onto the couch, watching her as she removed her earrings. "You're making enemies," he said. "No," she corrected. "I'm making sure I don't need friends who pretend to be allies." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You've changed." She paused, fingers still at her ear. "No, you just never looked closely before." That night she lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the city hum beyond the window. She thought about the night he called her too old to matter. The words no longer hurt, they barely even registered. And that's the quiet victory, isn't it? Not proving them wrong, but realizing they don't even have the language to define you anymore. In the morning, she would sign another round of checks. In the afternoon, she would meet with a legal advisor to formalize her control of the accounts. and he would watch helpless as the narrative he'd lived in began to dissolve, replaced by one where she was no longer the supporting character. She was the one writing the script. The legal advisor's office smelled faintly of leather and ink, the kind of scent that makes you think of permanence. Contracts, wills, signatures that outlive their signers. She sat across from the man in the navy suit, her hands folded neatly on the desk as he slid a document toward her. This, he said, is the formal authorization to transfer operational control of the accounts to you as the primary signatory. He will remain as a co-signer, but without your approval, nothing moves. She read every word, though she already knew them by heart. Weeks of quiet maneuvering had led to this. Every payment she'd approved, every vendor she'd visited, every investor she'd spoken to had been a brick in the wall that brought them here. Once he signs, the advisor added carefully, this is binding. She smiled faintly. He'll sign. You might think she was naive to assume that, but here's the truth. By the time you bring a man like him to this table, you've already built the cage. The signature is just the last click of the lock. That evening, she presented the document over dinner as though it were a formality. He glanced at it, then at her. What's this? Security, she said simply. The investors are nervous. This shows them someone responsible is in charge. He leaned back, studying her. And that someone is you. Yes. His mouth curved into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. You've been planning this. She met his gaze without blinking. I've been saving this. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he picked up the pen and signed his name, sprawling across the page like it could still dominate the space. She didn't thank him. She slid the paper back into the folder, stood, and left the table without a word. The next morning, her phone rang before sunrise. It was the bank manager. Mrs. Hart, the transfer is complete. You now have sole approval on all outgoing funds above $5,000. $5,000. She'd asked for 10 in the original conversation, but she'd revised it quietly, strategically. 5 gave her even tighter control. By noon, the office staff knew. By the end of the week, so did the vendors. And loyalty, the kind that comes from knowing your paycheck won't bounce, shifted fully into her orbit. He felt it. You could see it in the way he lingered in doorways during her calls, trying to gauge the tone, the respect, the weight in other people's voices. She didn't hide it from him. She wanted him to hear it, to understand that the respect he once demanded now came to her willingly. Then came the call from the investor who had once been his closest ally. Mariana, the man said warmly, if you're free next quarter, we'd like you to join the board officially. We think your steady hand would be an asset. She didn't say yes right away. Power is most effective when you let people work for it, even after it's already yours. I'll think about it, she replied, knowing full well she would accept. That night, he tried to reclaim some ground. We should make some joint appearances, he suggested, show a united front. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, I'll consider it, using his own phrase against him like a scalpel. You understand this dance, don't you? It's no longer about confrontation, it's about subtle refusals, the quiet shifting of gravity until the other person wakes up one morning and realizes the center of their world has moved without them. 2 weeks later, she hosted another dinner, this one in their own home. He was there, but he wasn't the host. She was, and everyone knew it. They came to her with questions, updates, ideas. They laughed at her remarks, quoted her decisions, sought her approval. When the evening ended and the door closed behind the last guest, he stood in the living room, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had walked into his own reflection and didn't recognize it. You've taken everything, he said quietly. She turned off the last lamp, plunging the room into the kind of darkness that feels intentional. No, she said, her voice calm, final. I took back what you didn't value. He didn't follow her when she walked away. Later, as she lay in bed, the city's distant hum seeping through the windows, she realized she no longer needed the moment she'd once fantasized about, the apology, the admission, the regret. His acknowledgement was irrelevant. She had become the axis on which everything turned, and she didn't need his validation to know it. The woman who knows her worth doesn't beg, she watches. Then she rises.